My name is Emotional John, and I am an invader. I invade people. I invade them, and I kill them. Does that make me a bad guy? Am I part of the problem? Let's talk it out. I began my invasion journey in Dark Souls. I had no idea how to become a Dark Wraith or Gravelord servant, but I did stumble upon the Forest Hunters. Before long, I was called to defend the forest and was in over my head. I didn't understand latency, or backstab windows, or poise values, or really anything about how to PvP in a game I could barely manage to play solo, let alone against competent players. So I got killed. A lot. And from my perspective, I was playing a specific role. I was one of the forest enemies I had previously outmaneuvered. I was there to obstruct the player, but not necessarily to halt them entirely. It felt to me that, in a very basic sense, I was supposed to lose. That the game had recruited me to add something extra to this area, both to dissuade other players from entering carelessly and to incentivize me to appreciate the function of the Covenant on a deeper level. I love that experience. I love everything about what it suggests and most of how it functions, but there's a problem with framing me as the aggressor in that scenario. Technically, I wasn't the invader. The hosting player was a trespasser in the forest, and I was defending it. Though I entered their world, they were, by the game's logic, in the wrong, and the game had recruited me to help stop them. So already we can see that even defining an invader is slightly more complicated than we may think. My second experience with invasions was in Dark Souls 2. I was uncomfortable with the idea of invading an innocent fellow player and stealing their blood for my own gain. It felt needlessly aggressive and largely contemptible. But when I found my way to the Blue Sentinels, I discovered an opportunity. To invade only the guilty. Now, as many of you are no doubt aware, this system existed in the first Dark Souls in the form of the Blade of the Darkmoon Covenant, but I killed Gwendolyn on every character because I hate God and seek conflict. But in Dark Souls 2, I had discovered a way to engage in PvP in what seemed to me a less hostile way. I wouldn't be killing those I would otherwise help, I would be killing those who deserve justice done onto them. I could celebrate violence not through malice, but vengeance. If I lost, I was protected from repercussions. If I won, I attained justice. It was a win-win. At its core, this system is an excellent idea, both from a gameplay and lore perspective. It lets people roleplay as heroes and villains. But there's another angle to this argument. If a player invades and kills another player, if they act not as a protector but as an aggressor, are they the bad guys? Well, sort of, but not in the way you might think. Let's focus on the intended experience of invasions. The invader invades and the host is supposed to kill them. For those of you in the know, you may believe this to be the intended experience as handed down on high by Miyazaki, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable pitch. Invader shows up to give the player a challenge, but more often than not, the player prevails. But I don't think that can really be true, or at least not entirely true. That sentiment makes sense when you consider the idea of an NPC invader, an enemy that utilizes the same tools the player has access to, set to trigger at an inopportune time. These encounters are meant to press the player when they're at their least prepared, removing their ability to set the pace of combat and force them to make split-second decisions. In this way, invasions are great teaching tools. Players can generally progress through extreme caution and timidity, slowly and carefully taking out enemies one at a time, their locations and behaviors easy to predict with enough practice. After all, players will try to minimize friction whenever possible. But a foe that responds unpredictably, with the same abilities as you, who knows where you are and has a gun? That's chaos. That's terror. It forces a fear response in players that teaches them sometimes you need to be brave, that if you want to succeed against the strongest of foes, you must become strong yourself, and not always in a way that you can prepare for. Invaders are set up to be the enemies you can't trick or avoid or prepare for. You have to fight them here and now, for better or worse. Only, when you consider NPC invaders, there's a problem. They are limited by their AI. They aren't designed to be cheesed or cheated, but doing so is extremely possible and generally rewarded. So how do you solve that problem? Easy. Make the invader a player, a living, breathing, awakened being with unlimited potential. All the same rules with the added benefits of being able to appear at random at any location and the ability to see through deception. I love this idea. I would go so far as to say it is the best idea in any game ever. The fact that modern games exist where you can't do this literally does not make any sense to me, and the fact that not every single person participates in this boggles my mind. And while I'm being extremely hyperbolic, I want to get my point across. Invading rules. And not only is it great fun to invade, it is great fun to be invaded. Obviously, not everyone feels this way. Many feel as though being invaded is an act of violation committed against an innocent party, people who are just trying to play the game. To those people, I have this to say. Being invaded is playing the game. You don't have to enjoy being invaded. I certainly didn't for the longest time. And not liking being invaded is just as fair as not liking being killed by a basic enemy who has spent their entire life waiting behind a corner to push you off a ledge. Getting killed sucks and is often unfair. Invasions are no different in that respect. But Emo John, you say, the invader has an unfair advantage. They use malicious tactics and are far more prepared. And that's a fair point. The type of person who is comfortable invading others has likely done their homework. They are most likely a practiced veteran who is seeking to test what they've learned on someone of lesser skill or preparedness. They're trying to kick your ass. But let me ask you, is that really so different from what Margit is doing? Godric? Radon? Morgott? Melania? The fire giant uses his shield as a sled and just somersaults away from you down a mountain. So many foes in the game know way more about the game, use malicious tactics, and are far more prepared. They're trying to kick your ass. The only real difference between the NPCs and player invaders is that the player isn't predictable. You don't know where they'll show up or what tactics they'll use. If bosses are the T-Rex, invaders are velociraptors. Big enough to mess you up with or without your SPAS 12, and small enough to get in your house. So when people say they hate invaders or being invaded, really what I think this all boils down to is animosity through friction. The idea that someone would attack you, when you might be having a hard enough time as is, can be extremely frustrating. It can take what was an excellent run and turn it into a sudden death inches from the finish line. The fact that a person, a living, likely human entity would reach out and stab you in the ass for their own amusement feels wrong. It feels malicious. It feels bad. But let's think about what these games are trying to facilitate. Overcoming tremendous odds with infinite attempts. In each of these games, there is no game over screen. Only a you died screen before you're returned to your last checkpoint. The game expects you to die. A lot. And those deaths are never permanent. You will always have another chance, so the consequences of death are finite. In Elden Ring, for example, they went so far as to add stakes of Marika, checkpoints placed to allow you to quickly return to the scene of a difficult encounter. This cuts down on a tremendous amount of friction in gameplay, while not damaging the overall difficulty and challenge of the encounter. On the whole, I think this is good design. If there's no benefit to trekking back to a tough boss, needing to do it over and over just ensures that the experience is not only challenging, but grueling. So when we add invaders into the mix, we get into a more nuanced discussion. Now you aren't necessarily getting the benefits of a catered boss fight. You likely won't have a stake of Marika, and you might be far from a grace. You might be low on resources, and if you die, you'll leave behind the runes you worked so hard for. Not to mention you'll need to start back at your last checkpoint and redo the whole thing. It restores a major degree of friction, and players generally hate friction, but it is an important element of these games that can otherwise be almost entirely removed given the right plan. An invader ensures the integrity of the intended game experience, even when the player has taken every advantage possible. And while the balance of that experience is going to vary widely, something I find more appealing than problematic, the takeaway should be clear. Invaders represent the game as much as any other enemy and as much as any other player. They are part of the experience in an integral way. So is the invader supposed to lose? Is the boss supposed to lose? Are you supposed to lose? I think the answer here is obvious. No one is supposed to lose, but someone will. That's what makes it a game. The idea that you can lose but aren't supposed to doesn't feel all that immersive to me. It feels patronizing, like everything the game has to offer is an illusion, like they're all just pretending to oppose me, but in the end I am expected to succeed. But a player invader challenges that idea in the most meaningful way. They are acting as a bad guy by opposing you, but they are another person with their own hopes and dreams and motivations. To them, you're the bad guy. You are intended to oppose one another. There is an aspect of game design I find indispensable. The bad guys want to win. In order for the game to have meaning, you as a player must assume that your opposition wants to stop you every bit as much as you want to stop them. This is best captured when the bad guy is another player who, by definition, has agency. So really, when we ask the question of whether or not invaders are the bad guys, the answer is yes and no. Both of you are the bad guys from the other's perspective, and both of you are acting in alignment with the game, and that's a good thing. For the unconvinced or those hostile to the idea of invasions regardless of the facts, let me ask you about the times you've been invaded. Do you remember the encounter? Did it change how safe you felt playing? Did it create tension or fear or anger? Did it evoke something in you? Something dormant and primal? What I'm asking is, did it immerse you? A quick side note on immersion, obviously because this is the internet and people love to meme and generally offend, you're going to run into players with terrible slur names using cheated stats or items to kill you in the most degrading way possible, but that's more of an external flaw rather than a built-in mechanic, even if the developers could certainly do more to curb such absurdities, but in any case, that's not exactly the intended experience, so let's set that aside. So again, let me ask you, did the invasion immerse you? Make you feel like there was something more to the world than you had previously suspected? Maybe remind you that you're not the only one seeking power in these lands? Boletaria, Lordran, Drangleic, Yharnam, Lothric, and the lands between all share a common theme: struggle. These lands are contested by all sorts, some helpful, some hostile, but they all facilitate the struggle of our characters. And that's a good thing. So does that mean invaders are good guys? Are they actually helping you? Well, not exactly. They're helping you in the same way pushing someone into a pool helps teach them to swim. It might work for some, but you're going to get a lot of folks drowning. But they are also helping in a way that reinforces the logic of the game, by acting on the motivations and expectations of that game logic. So let's talk about those motivations and expectations. What motivates someone to play these games? While I'm sure there are a myriad of reasons, I would venture so far as to say that a primary motivator is power. These games allow you to seek power, to become powerful. They are fantasy games after all, so it only makes sense that they would appeal to a power fantasy. When you get a new weapon or spell that does absurd damage to a boss, you should be filled with joy and reverence. In that moment, you've come a long way from the lowly tarnished who emerged from a cave. Everything in the game is telling you that is your motivation. Become powerful to kill powerful foes. So what happens when you run out of foes? When you tire of the same fights? When the limits of game design have become painfully clear and you simply have no more PvE horizons to reach? Or, what if you simply do not prefer to fight bosses and explore the terrain? Well, that's where invading comes in. An invasion generates unique conflict, where no matter how similar, no two experiences are the same. You can't practice to the point of knowing every move and when to dodge or jump or block. You can improve, but you can never be perfect, because your opponent is another player, and players are not pre-programmed. There are entire genres of games dedicated to this experience. Think of any modern first-person shooter or battle royale. The entire game is player-driven. Not that any Souls games are offering that sort of experience, but when we talk about PvP, the merits should be obvious. A game mode with practically infinite replayability that takes advantage of everything you've learned in the game and everything you've worked to acquire, allowing you to pit yourself against others who have endured the same struggle. It is the ultimate test a game can offer. It is the ultimate power fantasy. The motivation is clear. So what about expectations? Surely, even if there is great power and accomplishment in invading, it can't be considered expected. After all, I myself have framed them as random chaos designed to create friction. Think again, buddy. These games have a clear message. Expect the unexpected. How many times have you seen an item in the distance only for it to be a piece of shit surrounded by basilisks? That's right, every single time. These games are trying to trick you to keep you on your toes, probably to torture you. They have made the message very clear. You are never safe. In fact, the only time you are even remotely safe is when you're sitting at a grace, functionally not even playing. So if we can agree that you are not meant to feel safe, we can probably agree that invasions make a lot of sense filling that role. And now that we have the motivations and expectations covered, let's consider how the games frame invasions. In Elden Ring, invasions are a bloody simple interaction. Draw blood by hunting your fellows. You either invade to provide blood for the blood god, or you invade to wage war against the Erd Tree. These are important roles in-game that are best understood when experienced in PvP. Sure, I understand that Mohg is the Lord of Blood, and he loves Sleepy Baby God or whatever, but I understand him a lot better when I am acting on his behalf, knowing my actions taken against others are serving a greater purpose and helping me to understand his role in the lore. The same is true for the Volcano Manor. The NPC invasions are a great way to get players to think about the role of summonable NPCs and how helping the Tarnished helps the Erdtree, and how that opposes whatever Tanith and her boy band backup dancers are trying to accomplish. When you act as a recusant, you are warned of the heresy you commit. It helps you to establish that the simple act of killing your fellow Tarnished opposes the Erdtree and the Golden Order. It gives you a sense of purpose beyond what the typical progression might offer. So much is offered through invasions, even with Elden Ring having the weakest system by far. It allows invaders to roleplay beyond the scope of becoming Elden Lord, and that's a good thing. I feel I have firmly established my point. Invasions, and by extension invaders, are a good thing. They play as bad guys because these games are about conflict, and while they might be bad guys as individuals, invaders as a mechanic are not bad. They are the best things these games offer, in my not-so-humble opinion. Invasions are so much in the spirit of the game, I wouldn't know what to do without them. I would probably just keep expecting them and end my session disappointed. In fact, that's basically how I feel playing the game alone. I'm just going through the motions, collecting items, doing chores, until I can get to the real game where other players get involved. Obviously, not everyone shares my perspective. Lots of people consider these games primarily or entirely solo games, and that's reasonable enough. The vast majority of development goes into single-player design. Many of the areas and interactions are only accessible in single-player, and the ways to engage in multiplayer are relatively convoluted and difficult to utilize effectively. But my perspective does not refute those facts, instead posing an idea. These games are better with multiplayer. Before you jump down my throat in the comments section, please hear me out. What I am trying to highlight here is that multiplayer broadly, and invasions specifically, enhance the single-player experience, taking it beyond what it could ever be otherwise. I would never advocate for the games to require multiplayer, but I would be remiss to think it doesn't add far more than it removes. What invasions offer are so unique and so interesting that they can never be fully replicated without another player, and what they bring for the invaded player is something they cannot experience anywhere else. So let me end the video by asking something of you, gentle, soft, meek viewer who has never tasted the blood of another. Invade. Be invaded. Take up arms against your peers and demonstrate the power you wield. Act not as a tool of the two fingers or the greater will, but of your own volition. Test your strength and refine your tactics, honing your edge against the most unique and unpredictable foes any game has to offer. Seek violence, seek conflict, seek blood, seek death.